Hi, everybody. My name is Sean, and I'm an internal medicine urgent care physician working here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I wanted to kind of share with you my experience with driving anxiety, phobia, and agoraphobia. Essentially, this happened in June of 2023. Before this, I was driving perfectly. I would drive to and back from LA. For those of you who know, the LA area is like 350 miles away. So I would go like 700 miles a day without any problems whatsoever. And what had happened in June of 2023 is that I got kind of a vertigo, which led to like a panic attack on the freeway. So I was driving on the freeway and I got extremely dizzy, lightheaded. I had no idea what was going on because this has not happened before. And I kept driving for like 10 minutes and these symptoms got worse and worse. I got pulled off. I had to pull off the freeway. And essentially what had happened was, which I didn't really realize it at the time, was I had a panic attack. So that kind of became attached to driving, and especially freeway driving. So literally what happened is, one day I could drive everywhere, do anything, had no fear of driving. And the next day and the subsequent period ahead, I couldn't drive whatsoever. So basically what had happened is I had developed kind of a phobia to driving. And along with this, I had what's called agoraphobia, which is kind of a fear of being trapped. And if you think about it, you're kind of trapped, right? On the freeway, at stoplights, you have to kind of sit through them and you have nowhere to go. So the fear is that, if I go to one of these places, I'm gonna be trapped. And then what if I have this panic attack with these terrible physical symptoms and I can't leave and then I might faint? And that was kind of the thought process. So what happened is that over the next few weeks, I could, of course, not drive at all. And again, this was in June of 2023. And I had to, of course, keep going to work. I work for a public health system here in the Bay Area. I had to have family drive me everywhere. I couldn't even go to the grocery store. Essentially, other than residential neighborhoods, I was completely non-functional as a driver. So this went on for about 2 weeks, and I was also kind of depressed. I was really down. And then as I so often do, when I go through something, I kind of pick myself up and I look for the solution. So what I knew I needed was, one, I needed a medical evaluation, right? In internal medicine, whenever somebody comes into the problem, even if it seems like some type of mental health or something mental, you want to make sure that it's not there's not an underlying medical issue. So I underwent a big medical evaluation, and I also underwent a psychological evaluation. So the medical evaluation came back negative, and then kind of like maybe about 2 months later, in August of 2023, I was able to find a psychologist who worked with phobias, and that in itself was a challenge, just locating a psychologist who specialized in that. But, he did an evaluation of me, and his basic diagnosis was that I had a phobia with agoraphobia, which is a fear of being in spaces or areas where I feel trapped. And, what else describes this better in a way than stoplights, and even more so the freeway, right? So if I can just describe to you what I was kind of feeling if I would try to drive on these areas, because actually I tried and it didn't end up so well in terms of how I felt. But if I was at a stoplight, for example, I would get very sweaty. I would get extremely mentally anxious. But I think even more than that, what was surprising was how physical the symptoms of anxiety were. I would get lightheaded, I would get dizzy and nauseous, I would get hot. It was these rapid onset of these physical symptoms that was very difficult to deal with, that I had never had before in my life. And even though they're not dangerous, as a psychologist would explain to me, just it's kind of like a fear of the fear. And then along with these symptoms, you have this idea that, oh, I could pass out while I'm driving, right? Of course, you don't want to pass out when you're driving on the anywhere, but especially like on the freeway. So my driving was basically restricted to just driving on local roads. So the psychologist was absolutely wonderful. And so we began working together like one day a week, and, it wasn't cheap. I had to pay out of my pocket, but I was so affected by it. There's no other choice, right? I think sometimes somebody is affected by something in a mild way and they can kind of do self-help books or other types of treatment, but that wasn't me, right? I was completely non-functional. So the basic treatment to a phobia is you have to get exposed to it, right? So it's counterintuitive. I fear something, so the instinct is I don't want to do it, but you actually have to get in there and confront these fears. And with time, the fears and the physical anxiety kind of goes down. So the psychologist had me construct and write out like a hierarchy of physical tasks, right? The lowest is a residential neighborhood, which I was already doing, but that's the lowest tier. And then it'll go through stoplights, smaller stoplights, and then it'll go to bigger stoplights, making left turns on stoplights, expressways, freeways, further distance. So he had me write this out. And also along with that, of course, I had to practice, right, on my own time. So in the last 2.5 years, I probably spent 1,500 hours working on my driving. So it takes a lot of time commitment. So there's the exposure, there's a huge time commitment that's needed when you're actually doing the exposure. Now, along with this, a critical part to treating phobia was Dr. Z, as I'll call my psychologist. His background was cognitive behavioral therapy. So the idea with this is that you notice that you have distorted thoughts that lead to the anxiety, the panic, and you kind of attack and change those thoughts, right? Like 5 years ago, I could drive anywhere. There's no thought that I was trapped. I knew I could drive great, and there's no idea that, oh, I'm gonna have a panic attack, I'm gonna have these fears, I could faint. So the idea is that you identify them, call them out, and you replace them with realistic thoughts, right? So one idea I always had is, oh, you're gonna get anxious, you're gonna feel dizzy, and you're gonna faint on the freeway. Well, the fact is that when you're really anxious or panicky, the blood pressure goes up, as I know by experience. So to faint takes an abrupt drop in blood pressure. And I've never seen a drop in blood pressure, much less abruptly. And I've checked my blood pressure like 1,000 times in the last 3 years since I'm dealing with this issue. So that's the distortion. So he would have me write that out. And there are all these other distortions, right? That, why I should fear the left side of the freeway, what can happen if I have a panic attack on the road. A critical fact is that even though panic, anxiety, and the symptoms are dangerous, they don't stop me from driving, and they don't prevent me from controlling the car properly. And I knew this because the first time I had a panic attack, when I didn't even know what it was, I controlled the car perfectly fine. I drove for 10, 15 minutes and then I pulled off. Yeah, it was very uncomfortable, but I completely controlled the car. I didn't get into an accident. And that's been my experience over the last 2 years. So cognitive behavioral therapy is a huge part of the therapy. Now, along with the exposure, the time commitment, and then the cognitive behavioral therapy, there's also what Dr. Z introduced me to as interoceptive exposure. So I knew I've had a great fear of the anxiety and its physical symptoms. I didn't want to get dizzy, nauseous, hot on the freeway, right? Even though I knew it was kind of a paper tiger and it was more symptomatic, but it didn't actually prevent me from controlling the car and driving properly. I feared it, so I wouldn't drive because of that fear. Well, he said, well, you have to lose the fear to that. So you have to kind of basically create these symptoms and learn that you can keep functioning. So I would just, he had me hyperventilate actually, like for 60, 90 seconds, right? So hyperventilation is you're breathing quickly and you get those lightheaded, dizzy symptoms. And this is where I think it's critical to have a professional working with you, because I was doing it at home, but I never did it on the road, even though he had told me to do it on the road. So eventually, I listened to him, I started doing it on the road, and it's critical to do it because at first I would do it just in residential areas, right? I would drive in a quiet neighborhood, I would hyperventilate for like 60 seconds and then keep driving, and it was fine. And then it was because of him kind of making the suggestion, oh, you should do this on the freeway, you should do this on bigger areas, that I did start doing it on expressways. And you know what I discovered? That even though on the expressways here, you can drive, 50, 60 miles an hour, so it's kind of like a freeway junior, even though I felt lightheaded, even though I felt dizzy, I could always control the car. My blood pressure was fine when I took it. In other words, it was a nuisance, but it didn't affect how I drove. So that's a critical part of losing that fear. It's kind of an exposure, along with the exposure to the road. This is kind of an exposure to the physical symptoms of anxiety. Now, one other big thing he did is he introduced me to a book from the person who kind of trained him, Dr. Burns from Stanford. And I read through that book completely. It was like, 300 pages. And it was very important to my being able to overcome this issue. Because for me, it's been so onerous. It's almost like I had to take a course, right? In college, when you take a course, you have the professor, but you're usually going off a text or some type of written guide. So that was my written guide, right? I would meet with Dr. Z an hour a week, but then I had to read, I had to do a lot of this work on my own, kind of like homework, so to speak. Reading, driving, going through all this cognitive behavioral therapy, doing interoceptive exercises. So it was very important for me to read. I independently began reading and seeking out my own sources. If you go on YouTube, there's an agency, or like there's a organization called, I think, American Society of Anxiety, something of that sort, and I'll list that in my in the description. But they do, for example, they had a great series of talks on anxiety, and I read one of the books from the authors there, a book by one of the authors, his name is Saif, but eventually I ended up reading like 3 or 4 more books, and the philosophy of some of these books are different. Like the Saif book, which is critical, speaks about kind of an acceptance therapy. So the way this works is you accept that anxiety, panic, fear will come, but you accept them, you understand that they're not harmful, you understand that they will pass, and you kind of keep doing whatever you're doing despite them. So it's kind of a variant of Dr. Z's philosophy, and it was critically important to me because all what Dr. Z taught me, the cognitive behavioral therapy, the interoceptive exercise, was important to me, but I found is when I drove, that anxiety, the agoraphobia, the physical symptoms would come on anywhere, and that's where the acceptance therapy was really helpful. I knew I could keep driving. I knew with time that these feelings would diminish as my body understood that these were just kind of a temporary type of state of affairs. The more I got exposed and the more I permitted them to kind of go through me, they would just go through me and go away. You can't really fight them, right? Like in the beginning, I had this idea that, oh, you're going to do cognitive behavioral therapy, you're going to get exposure, and you won't suffer these symptoms. But that's not realistic, and that's where the acceptance therapy was very, very important. Additionally, what I also did on my own was I just did what I call like a motivational component, right? I kind of thought about what other people are going through, and I have a ready-made kind of a situation where I can see how people are going through, right? Because I work in medicine and urgent care, and I've diagnosed in the last 3-4 years 2 patients with testicular cancer, young men who are perfectly healthy, and then all of a sudden they have their life turned upside down, dealing with surgery, dealing with kind of the whole treatment for this cancer, and they're young and healthy. I've had other patients who've had breast cancer, who've had metastatic cancer, and my thought was, hey, if these people are dealing with this, why am I complaining about driving, which is such a light issue anyway, right? So it's kind of in that vein of thinking, like just being glad to be alive, being able to be happy, being able to be healthy, and I kind of would write out these statements. One other thing Dr. Z did that was very, very important was he suggested to me, why don't you tape some of these cognitive behavioral therapy, these distortions into an audio file and just listen to them. So I really took that to heart, right? I taped a lot of these distortions and kind of the responses to them, and I would just listen to them in the car when I was on an exercise bike. And my idea with all of these exposure, driving, listening to these files is I'm not going to do it one time. I know it's not going to filter through, but if I do it 10 times, 100 times, 500 times, it'll sink in. So I started recording these files, and I also started summarizing the books that I read, and I would do like a highlights. Some of them, the files were like an hour long, some of them were like 10 minutes, but I would just kind of dictate them and just listen to them. And it was kind of like listening to myself give therapy to me. I had never really heard my voice before. So it was kind of interesting listening to these audio files as a kind of a critical part of this whole process. So what I would say is important is, one, I always had a positive attitude. You have to find the right psychologist, one who deals with phobia, cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy, interoceptive therapy, being not afraid of the physical symptoms of anxiety, being prepared to devote a lot of time to it, listening to audio files, motivational component, acceptance therapy, and repetition. I mean, there's no chance I would be where I am today driving-wise if I hadn't repeated all of these areas. And I will say that I never stopped my life. I never put this whole problem on the throne. I continued to work. I barely missed any days. I continued interacting with family. I tried to kind of maintain my mood as best as I could. I didn't let myself fall into depression. And I just continued my life while I was working on this, even when I could drive nowhere. For example, I had to study for the board exams in October of 2023, 4 months after I had this panic attack. So I couldn't just wallow in self-depression. So I had to, study hundreds of hours for that. I continued to write like a fantasy book that I'd been writing for the last few years, and I published that on Amazon. My life continued. I just didn't put this on the throne. And it's just been such a difficult journey. And I know I'm becoming a better person, but that's my motivation for doing this video and then the subsequent videos I'm planning on doing. And I've also written an ebook which kind of summarizes chapter by chapter what I went through. And my hope is that somebody who's afflicted by this can kind of see some type of a guideline and a pattern that I used. So this ebook, which I published on Amazon, kind of goes through the process that I went through and all of the techniques I'm describing in great detail. Because for me, it's such an onerous, complicated thing. There's no way, I think, just listening to somebody is sufficient. I think one has to do a lot of reading, a lot of work, a lot of effort. And that's a big part of my motivation for these videos and these ebook. And I think if you undergo a mental health evaluation, medical health evaluation, and kind of go through this process, once you set a framework in place, your driving will improve quickly. So June of 2023, I could drive nowhere suddenly after this happened. And it took me probably like 8 months before I felt comfortable on local roads, right? So that takes us into like the latter part of 2024. And even then it was not easy. So November of 2024 is when I got back on the freeway, and it was faster because I had this whole framework on how to attack it in place, right? So the freeway is the most challenging because traffic is obviously going really quickly. Roads merge into the freeway, so you can't just be sitting on the right side of the freeway and have that reassurance, so I could pull over if needed. Many of the freeways, some of the merges are like 2-3 lanes. So all of a sudden, even though you might be in the right lane on the freeway, all of a sudden after a merge, you're suddenly in the middle of the freeway. So you have to have yourself mentally put together to be able to do that. So it took me, from November of 2024 until like the middle of last year, middle of 2025, where I drove like 100 miles on the freeway, but all of this was up that hierarchy. So I really hope that you're able to get something out of these videos and kind of like craft your own treatment plan. And I plan to kind of do a video on one chapter of my book at my time. And I absolutely wish all of you, who are dealing with anxiety, phobia, agoraphobia like I am, the very best. And I think if you just apply work, commitment, a good attitude, I think you'll get where you need to be. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.